The first half of tonight's thing is going to be kind of academic. I've got something here that I've never tried to do before, a little poster board, some of the names that I'm going to mention going through this thing. There's a few pages, so you'll see me try to fumble with that at some point. To sort of tell you the entire story of the Tuatha de Dannan. And then the second half is going to be discussing some of the more ways of using sort of neo-shamanism, today's approaches that we can maybe connect with these spirits, these energies that we talk about to help us in our day-to-day lives, you know, with healing and things like that, or just general divination and looking for answers, you know, for some kind of other higher voice, you know, however you want to term them. So that's the quick and dirty on that. But first off, welcome. Thank you to everybody who's here tonight. I hope that you find this entertaining and informative, and that you can take something from it. You know, this is a story that I've told many times over the years, and it's one that I'll probably be telling for a very long time. It's one that's not told very often, and also it is a story that it's a miracle that we even know it in the first place, because, you know, when you talk about Celtic and Nordic traditions, you're basically looking at oral traditions that went on for, you know, 1,000 years, 2,000 years, whatever you want to say, before the arrival of the Christians, when they came along at various times after, you know, the early part of the first millennium. And then they started hearing these stories and writing them down. So we have two things with that. We have one, that these are the interpretations of people at the time. The authors that were writing these things are looking at it from a Christian perspective. So sometimes they might ring a little bit in the same way, that they're trying to match them up to certain ideas that are in the Christian faith. And then other times they're just regional, you know, particularly with the Celts. The Celts they weren't ruled by one main kingdom. They were literally valley to valley and all of this, all over Europe, you know, primarily Western Europe. And then the further north you get, it eventually becomes Scandinavia, and that's where the Nordic tradition comes in. And we'll talk about that next week. I hope you can join me for that. But I'm always excited to talk about the Tuatha de Dannan, because they were one of the first things that I sort of, the story of the Tuatha de Dannan was one of the first things that I really latched onto when I started going through my transformation a little over 10 years ago, because of my illness and things like that I write about in my book. And so I found a lot there. And so, but part of the thing was that since it's really only based on two old sources, one's in Old Irish and one's in Middle Irish, that there's first translation, and then there's of course the subsequent writings, and then over the millennia since, there's been reinterpretation, and then other Celtic things started coming into the whole body of what we think of today as Celtic gods and goddesses. But in this instance, it's really the closest thing that we have to a creation story, without really being a creation story, in the Celtic world. So I guess I'll just start it off this first hour, like I said, it's kind of academic. Just tell you the story as I know it, from hearing it from various places. There's some works that I rely on that I see as, you know, pretty consistent in their oldness and respect to the oldness. And not a lot of writing about the Tuatha de Dannan has been done throughout all of the, you know, from the Renaissance on, to really change that story. Though some of the people that you'll hear me mention tonight certainly have been sort of reinvented along the way and recharacterized, but this is in their first iteration. And so with that, we will start this sort of teaching tale of the Tuatha de Dannan. And I hope that it does good for the person that tells it, and does good for the people who choose to listen right now. So first off, let's start at the beginning. For the Celtic world, the way that it goes is for those who dare to jump into the world, that one point, Aaron put on a coat of trees for 3 days, and then put on a coat of hills and mountains for 3 days, and plunged into the world from another world, and thus became born the land of Aaron. And so with that, you have this land that is growing over these years, and there's people that live there at the time. The two principal groups of people that live there, we'll get there in the next slide here, slide. But to start off, we'll deal with the Tuatha de Dannan. Where do they come from first, before we introduce how they come to the land of Erin? First off, all that we know about the Tuatha de Dannan is that they come from these things called the 4 cities of instruction, all right? These are 4 cities, mythological cities, islands. It's kind of vague, but they come from these 4 places, and they are Philius, Gorius, Phineus, and Mirius, right? They are the city of stone, the city of the spear, the city of the sword, and the city of the cauldron. You know, notice these things echo throughout the Celtic world from time beyond to the years after. They're reinterpreted. And let me get something off my screen here. But, so what happens is, the Tuatha de Dannan decide, they have a council among themselves, they're a group of people, they are literally the children of Danu. Danu being the closest thing that we have to like a Mother Earth, all-mother figure in the Celtic tradition. We don't have any description of anything involving Danu, nothing that Danu ever says, what Danu looks like, not even that Danu is a female, male, whatever. All that we know is that these are the children of Danu. Tuatha de Dannan means the children of Danu, or in some ways that sometimes people look at it, the people of art and skill. The art and skill comes from these 4 cities of instruction. So that's the Tuatha de Dannan. They decided that they were going to leave the 4 cities and to come to the land of Erin, and that they arrived one day. It was May 1st in the year. They arrived either on dark clouds coming from the sky or dark clouds coming from the sea. 300 ships land either on the beach or on the mountaintop, depending on the 2 oldest stories that we have. And they burn their ships so that they will not be tempted to flee, to leave. They were here to stay. And so once they're on this area, they burn their ships. That's the end of the story of the arrival of the Tuatha de Dannan coming into the land of Erin that was thus created, assumedly by Danu, or Danu created them. We're really not sure on that. Danu could be a sort of Mother Earth figure. But if you go back in all of the oldest pagan traditions in Europe, all of them were born originally of a goddess figure. Even in the Nordic thing, prior to Odin, there was a goddess figure. We'll talk about that next week. Let me flip this over and we'll see what's going on in the land of Erin at the time they got there. So, the land of Erin at the time was already inhabited by 2 populations of people, you could say. One were the Firbolg, the people of the leather bag. That's all we really know about them. They were strong, they were very industrious, they lived in the hills, they had these fortresses, they were hard workers, and they were skilled in military might. Then we had the Femorians, who lived somewhat either in the seas or on the islands around the land of Erin, but they were versed in more magical ways to some extent, still very strong. They were on the waves, the Firbolg was on the land. The Tuatha de Dannan show up, and they decide that, okay, first off, but the Femorians and the Firbolg had been fighting for some time. They had a sort of uneasy truce. The Femorians were actually kind of stronger than they were, as it appears. The Firbolg, though, it was hard for them to actually be subservient to the Femorians. The Femorians were a little bit more powerful and crafty with their sort of magical ways, but they couldn't really do much because they had the water behind them, and the Firbolg had the hills behind them, and so they had this sort of uneasy truce. But it was the Firbolg that actually had the land. Thus arrives the Dannans, the Tuatha de Dannan, the children of Danu. Now let's talk about some of the individual characters within the Tuatha de Dannan. Okay? First off, we have the Dáide. The Doida is one that is sort of the cleric or the druid of the Tuatha. He is the one who has the direct connection with Danu, who was the one that could speak to the trees and knew all the sort of more Celtic things that we get in later years of nature and things like that. He had also two things. He had his harp that he would play. It was wonderful music that anybody that heard it would dance. And this comes back later in the story. So he had his harp. And he also had the cauldron. And you remember the cauldron from Morius, the city of the city is on the first page. There was the spear, the sword, the stone, and the cauldron. He was the one that had the cauldron. All right? And so the cauldron in the story goes that no matter who came up to the cauldron to eat from it, nobody ever left hungry. Now, they don't really discuss what that means, if it's more of an advisement thing or a literal nutritional thing, but the cauldron becomes this symbol of something that is all fulfilling. So the Doida, or Dagda, as some people say, but the Doida, as it is heard in the way that the teachers I've heard talk about it, he had the harp and he had the cauldron, and he was the one that was connected with Danu, more so than the rest of her children. Then we have Nuana. He was the king. He had the sword. Remember the city of the sword? He had a sword that nobody could stand against. Anybody that faced the sword would have to tell the truth. They could not resist the power of the sword. And he was the king of the Tuatha de Dannan. Now there's a lot of other characters involved here. If you go down the list of names that we have from these old texts, there's probably 20 or 30 different ones that have various aspects, and some of them are really never mentioned other than in a given line. Some of them have a lot mentioned. But for today, and the ones that we're going to be talking about in the rest of this story and then also afterwards, I want to point out just a few here. First, we have Brigade, which a lot of people are probably familiar with Brigade because she, along with the Morrigan, I'll talk about her in a second, or it in a second. Brigade, a goddess of wisdom and a certain amount of healing and all this. And of course, she propagates throughout much of Celtic Europe. But she originally was one of the Tuatha de Dannan. So Brigade is there. We have Lu, who is with the spear. We heard of the city of the spear. Lu is the one in possession of the spear. Not at this point. In fact, Lu isn't even really arriving right now. He comes into the story later. But I wanted to mention him here because I'm going to be talking about him later. So we have the Doida, Nuana, Brigade, and Lu, and then of course the Morrigan. Now this is an interesting one because the Morrigan has probably more than any other Celtic idea, especially from the Tuatha de Dannan, have been changed and warped in so many ways that she's hardly recognizable today. In these days, it was just basically one individual, but it has the instead of just Morrigan, because there's also this idea that she is the creation of three other lesser goddesses, okay? And they deal with everything from birth to death to battle. So it's a very complex character with the Morrigan, and that's why in years afterwards, we'll talk more about this later on, that she becomes almost demonized and turned into a sort of witchy person and things along those lines. In King Arthur's court and later Shakespeare stuff, the name gets corrupted and changed into this sort of, other thing, or like Maleficent or whatever it is from Disney. I think it's based originally on this idea, but at this point, the Morrigan is in no way a dark or evil type of presence. Now granted, the Morrigan is one that is learned in magic, and so the people of art and skill, as we talked about, the Tuatha de Dannan, they were skilled in science and in magic and in all kinds of craftsmanship. So she had a sort of magical way about her. Then we get over to Dame Techt, one of my favorite characters. This whole line here, this is my favorite story of the whole thing, the one that I used the most along my line. Dame Techt is the chief physician, you could say, of the Tuatha de Dannan, and also shares in the magical sense, the healing powers of Dame Techt. are indisputable, could heal anything. And we'll hear more about that when we get to the next couple of pages when things start going crazy, particularly with Nuana. Then we have his two children, Miak and Ermid. And we'll get to them in a second more, but Ermid is associated a lot with nature, plants, and things like that in the woodlands. Miak, of course, becomes an even greater healer than Danchek, and we'll get to that story when we get to the two battles of Montoro here in a second. And then we have down here at the bottom, one more that I wanted to identify for tonight is Manananan, how do you say that? Look at that. My Irish is not as good as it could be. Manananan MacLear, all right? One of these hero type characters, a lot of strength and things like that. And there's others, there's Angus, there's others that are in the mix that could have come into that thing. And then later we have Cuchulainn and heroes like that, which are similar to Beowulf in the Nordic tradition. But here I wanted to include him in particular because he's instrumental with the last page of all this. So this is sort of introducing the land of Erin, now that you've heard about the Tuatha de Dannan, who they were originally, what's going on in Ireland when they arrive, the land of Erin, and a sort of introduction into a few of the principal deities, characters, whatever you want to say, that we're going to talk about as we go forward on these next slides, I guess we'll say. So I'm going to change over to the next one now and go on to that. So what happens? What happens when two groups of people are already living in the general area of the land of Erin, which you can already guess is going to become the land of Ireland, the Emerald Isle? Well, when the Tuatha gets there, the Femorians are sort of out in the sea in their way and not really paying much attention, or at least not involved in the story. The Fir Bolg are very much on the land. And so when the Tuatha de Dannan land their ships either on the sea or the mountaintops and burn their ships so that they don't have to go away, they're faced with a situation now. There's people already living here. What are we going to do about that? So they send their chief poet, as the story goes, to speak to the chief poet of the Fir Bolg. And they decide that things are not going to be peacefully resolved, therefore there's going to be a fight. And so what the Tuatha de Dannan propose is that it is a fight of equal numbers. Now this was not good news for the Fir Bolg because they greatly outnumbered the Tuatha de Dannan, and they thought, frankly, that they were stronger, so they should be able just to take them, no big deal. But that was the terms, and so the Tuatha de Dannan said, we will fight you with equal numbers until we win or all of us are dead. And so the Fir Bolg accepted that. And so thus we have the first battle of Montoro. Okay, Montoro, Toya, there's many ways I've heard it said, but the first battle of Montoro, there's 3 battles, and so this is the first one of them. And it is the Tuatha de Dannan versus the Fir Bolg. You like that? It's like a sports thing. So the Fir Bolg, of course, already lived there. Strong, mountaintops, skilled in war, very tough people. And you have the Dannans, which are more art and skill and some magic. And so on the first day of the battle, it does not go well for the Tuatha de Dannan. They are pretty much just slaughtered. And that night, the Fir Bolg build a big cairn, which is a big pile of skulls of the Tuatha, and they burn them. And they're celebrating all night long. And news was heavy for the Tuatha. They didn't know, exactly how this was going to go, but they figured they would try again on the second day. Now on the second day, King Nuana, remember, the guy that was the king, he had the sword, he goes up against the number 1 fighter of the Fir Bolg. His name is Shrang. In 1-to-1 combat, Shrang, in one swipe, chops off the arm of Nuana at the shoulder. And so Nuana now is without an arm. And And at that point, contact breaks for the day, and they go back and they regroup. That evening, Dang Chek, who was the healer that I mentioned on the first page, Dang Chek, the master healer, he digs a pond and puts in it this water. They have him bring all this water. And of course, Brigade is there with her wisdom and her healing and advising them. And Dang Chek is like bringing all the wounded Tuatha de Dannan into the pond and healing them through this magical thing and everything. But that night, while this is going on, his son Miak, who I mentioned before, accidentally, while he's trying to help somebody heal, falls into the water. And he himself, already being a gifted healer, remember he's the son of Dang Chek, he all of a sudden just illuminates in healing possibility and gets out, and the story just continues at that point and helps heal the people. We'll get back to why that's important later on. So that's what happens that night. Also, in the morning, Dang Chek concocts an arm out of silver, and he attaches it to Nuana, the king, so that he can hold his sword again. This sort of silver arm is attached to him. But the problem is, the rule that the Tuatha de Dannan have, that Brigade reminds them of, is that nobody that is not fit fully in spirit or body can be king. So therefore, Nuana cannot be king. They didn't have anybody else really to step up into the king role at this point. So they did have one guy named Breath, who was actually, they had been there some time. This is where the story gets kind of convoluted in time, but Breath was actually the son of half Tuatha, half the Femorian. Okay. Now we do have other things in here that talk about how they grow in the span of hours and all this, and this is where the story gets very fanciful, but just go with it at this point. So Breath now is inserted in as the temporary king. But the Tuatha de Dannan aren't really sold on that, but they have to have a king. So okay, Breath, this young guy that's all big and tough and strong, we're gonna make him king, but the Doida, remember the Doida with the harp and the cauldron and the connection to Danu, he's going to be the one to lead us into battle the next day. And so that was the plan. That night, the Morrigan, who was also not really sold on this plan, comes into the scene with a little bit of her sorcery. And what she does is she turns into a raven or a wisp, or however you want to look at it, and goes all throughout the Firbolg camps throughout the night and convinces them that they have no hope, that they're going to lose. And she slowly drains their morale through this sort of illusionary, deceptive type of thing. Well, the next day they wake up, the fighting resumes, and the Tuatha de Dannan are just pushing the Firbolg from the field. No problem. Everything's going really well. But still, they'd suffered a whole lot of losses the first 2 days. Day 3, they're finally doing well. They're out there fighting, and so things come to an end, and right now they're about equal on how many each side has lost. There's still plenty of Tuatha de Dannan left. There's still lots of Firbolg left. And so that's where we stand at the end of the day 3 of the Battle of Montoro. And so over that night, Nuana comes back in and says, listen, how about I just do one-on-one combat with Shreng, their champion, and see if we can just do it on equal numbers like that. So on day 4, it opens up with Nuana challenging Shreng to one-on-one combat. But the caveat being that since he has lost his arm and only has this sort of half arm, this metal arm that he can't, it's not fully there and operational, that Shreng would have to fight with one arm behind his back to make it equal. Now remember, the Morrigan had been spreading in all their consciousness that they were not going to be able to win. And apparently Shreng was one of these as well. And he turns it down and he says, no, I don't want to do that. And so they reach a peace. And so the Tuatha de Dannan agree to give the Firbolg the western provinces of the land of Erin if they will go in peace, and the Tuatha de Dannan will become the leaders of their land and have peace. So that's the end of the first battle of Montoro. The Firbolg have the west, the Tuatha de Dannan are in the east. Now, at the bottom here, we have peace, but things aren't always as peaceful as they could be. Here we enter into a part of the saga where there's lots of individual tales about the Tuatha de Dannan. There's the Cooley County Cattle Raid by the Morrigan, which we could talk about in another time. There's lots of little sub-stories, but one of them that I really like is that after this was over, Dang Chek, he was, I gotta get something on my screen. Dang Chek was kind of, I guess for lack of a better word, kind of upset, kind of pissed off that his son had, become kind of pretty good at what he does in healing. Well, what Miak does next, his son, is that he goes up to Nuana and he says, I'll tell you what, how about you give me a shot at fixing your arm? And so he runs his hands down the arm of Nuana, that silver sort of mechanical arm that Dang Chek that somehow concocted. And he says, bone to bone, sinew to sinew, flesh to flesh. And when he does that, the arm comes back fully healed as a full arm, a regular arm. So now Nuana is back full in spirit and back full in body. And so now he can become king. Dang Chek is so upset about this that he has shown him up. He has become a better healer, that he approaches him off to the side, off in the woods by himself. Miak is there bathing by a stream, and Dang Chek comes up to him in a fit of rage, and he pulls out his sword and he swipes at his son, and he cuts the skin. And Miak just looks at him like, Father, what are you doing? And he fixes his skin. He just rubs his hand on it and fixes it. And then Dang Chek reels back and chops him on the head. And this time there's a big flesh wound. And of course Miak is stunned for a second, and then he fixes it himself. The third time, Dang Chek slams the sword down on his skull, goes through his brain, and Miak falls to the earth dead. Aramid, the daughter of Dang Chek and the sister of Miak, is standing right there and sees all this and is enraged. And Dang Chek, of course, seeing what he has done, flees the scene. Then Aramid, as her brother is dying, notices that where the outline of his body is on the ground, there is a collection of herbs, healing herbs, being sort of populating the area of his body. And in all, there is said to have been 365 herbs that show how to fix and heal any part of the human body. And as she takes off her cloak and lays it down beside him, and she's starting to move them over to save them, move them from where the body was onto this so that she can preserve this knowledge of healing forever. And at this moment, Dang Chek returns to the scene, sees what she is doing, and puts his foot on it and messes it all up. And as it goes, that was the last opportunity that humanity had to fully understand the healing capacity of nature. And we've been trying to figure it out since. That's a little side story, but I really like that one. That the death of Miak, when he died, is literally, you think of a crime scene layout, a body, but it filled with the 365 herbs, and they were on each part of the human body that they would heal. And she was trying to preserve that, and he messed it up. And there's so many sub-stories in that story of the father, the son, jealousy, and there's so much to it. But I really like the way that it ends, and the principal people that I've heard talk about it is that we've been trying to figure it out since, as far as healing. So that's the Miak and Aramid part here at the bottom. By the way, Juliana Terrace will be posting in the comments below screenshots of these. And there's a couple of places where you can see that I kind of, in my haste, that wasn't as beautiful as it could be. But anyway, that's the first Battle of Montoro. And then also the story of Danchek and Miak and Ermid, which I think is a great story. And then you heard a little bit about the Morrigan there. Now let's go on to what happens after this relative era of peace. And we'll talk more at the end of this story about some of the ways that you could look at this in the, say, archaeological or real historic narrative as far as years, because there actually is some work in that, and I'll touch on that at the end. But for now, we'll just keep going. The second Battle of Montoro is, now remember, in the seas, we had the Femorians. So now that the Tuatha de Dannan are in charge of the land of Erin, they have taken stewardship of the land of Erin, the kings of the Tuatha de Dannan now are in charge. The Femorians decide it's time for them to show their face in this whole thing and to have a little discussion with the Tuatha de Dannan. And so what I want to do is to have a little couple side stories to sort of set up this fight. You remember Bress? Bress was the sort of young, strapping character in the story that was part Femorian, part Tuatha de Dannan, who was named king temporarily after Nuana lost his arm, okay? Well, after Nuana got his arm back healed by Miak, they sort of deposed the king, not in a nasty way, but just said, hey, you know, Nuana's the rightful king, he's back the king again. Bress didn't like this. And so Bress, remember, is the son of a Femorian. There were 4 Femorian kings at the time. Ethoa and Baelor are the 2 principal ones that we hear the most about. There's Terror of the Seas, and I forget the name of the 4th one, but they all had sort of regions they went for. Now, Baelor was quite a force to be reckoned with. He was called Baelor of the Baleful Eye. He had an eye that was covered in leather and covered in copper so that nobody could see it. And if he opened it up, anybody that beheld it was instantly turned to stone. So nobody messed with Baelor of the Baleful Eye. But he happened to be Bress's father. So Bress decides, you know, I'm going to go to my father and see if I can't convince him to help me take my kingship back of the Tuatha de Dannan, because he felt slighted. So this is Bress and Baelor, all right? So Baelor decides, okay, let's go. And they then go into the second Battle of Montoro. Now, this is not a battle that has all of the day-to-day activities of the first one. The first one is much more detailed in the storytelling. This one basically comes down to 2 things. One is that Baelor and Bress show up there. Lou is another character that I want to introduce real fast. Lou, at the same time that Baelor and Bress decide to come down, Lou is a similar person. He is part Femorian and part Tuatha de Dannan. But when he comes to the Dannans, he wants to join them. And they say, well, you know, what can you do? And he says, well, I'm a great craftsman. And they say, well, we have plenty of craftsmen. And he goes, well, I can do sorcery and magic. And they say, well, no, we have plenty of people that can do that. And he goes through this whole laundry list of things that he can do. And eventually, the Doida, who's making the call on this, who's accepting him into, I guess, decides that since he's so versatile, that they'll let him in. And so Lou becomes fully in the Tuatha de Dannan story at this time. And Lou, of course, ends up becoming, in this whole thing, one of the principal characters. Because during the battle that comes on, Bress and Baelor are the ones that are the antagonists that come against the Tuatha de Dannan. Lou ends up slaying Baelor with a sling of all things. Now there's an echo there of David and Goliath. We don't know for sure if that's exactly if that would have been written differently had a Christian not interpreted it that way. Anyway, he does slay him. Afterwards, Bress feels bad about all this, surrenders to the Tuatha de Dannan, and teaches them some of the skills that the people that were already on the land had, and in the sea, teaches them agriculture. So that allows them to set up a new era of Tuatha de Dannan, where they're not just relying on their arts and skills and magic. Now they can actually grow the land, and they start to populate the land even more. And some of the places that you'll find today in Ireland are all of the cities and historic places that are tied to the story at this point. So Bress is forgiven and teaches the Dannans agriculture. That's the end of the fight between the Femorians and the Dannans, because Baelor was the chief antagonist for the Femorians. And that's the end of the Second Battle of Montoya, which in most instances is the end of the Tuatha de Dannan struggle, sort of fight. But that doesn't really explain what happens to them ultimately. We enter into a time of peace, where that lasts for 1,000 years. I mean, you look at the way that they have the genealogy of this laid out, and they do have it laid out, like from 1750 BC to 1620. I mean, they have all these dates of these Tuatha de Dannan kings. Now, we don't really know how accurate that is. We'll talk more about that later. So now we have the Second Battle of Montoro. So now the Dannans pretty much are ruling the whole place. The Firbolg are reduced to sort of an after story at this point. And now the Tuatha de Dannan have the land of Erin, which becomes the land of Ireland, as you can tell. And so now let's move on. Things are going so well in Ireland that people start to take notice on the mainland. And from the area of basically Spain and places like that, we don't really know exactly where, but somewhere from the mainland comes these people called the Malaysians, okay? Now the Malaysians they sound very much like everyday sort of kind of people, you might say. They are just regular warriors, sort of conquerors. They come on regular ships. They're not associated really with any kind of magic or anything like that. The Firbolg, they had, people with leather bag. We don't really know what's going on with the leather bag. We had the Femorians, which had the one eye for coveting, the one arm for reaching, and the one step to invade, as is talked about. I mean, they had these mystical properties of coming out of the sea. But with the Malaysians, they're pretty much just sound like a logical end to the story when regular, everyday invading forces come into the thing. You could say less fanciful, less mythological, or whatever sounding. But what the Tuatha do is the Tuatha de Dannan decide that they're going to raise a magical storm in the sea to keep the Malaysians from invading. And so they do all this, and it really has no effect. And so they land on the shore, and the Tuatha really don't know what to do about this. So they end up, there's no fight here per se, at least not that I've read about or I know about. But anyway, it doesn't matter, because what happens next is they get tricked. The chief poet of the Malaysians comes and talks to the chief poet of the Tuatha de Dannan, and they decide that they are going to make a deal on how to split the land. Now, how this really went, there's no real explanation, but the deal comes out like this, that the Malaysians get above the ground and that the Tuatha de Dannan get below the ground. Well, that doesn't sound very fair. So what happens next is there's some running battles and some mentions of some conflicts, but ultimately what's happening here is that the Tuatha de Dannan are losing their control of the land of Erin. And so what ends up happening, the guy at the bottom of the page, on the first page that I mentioned to you, Magnanan MacLear, he leads the Tuatha de Dannan up to these hills, these hollow hills, and leads them into the hills, these mounds, these hollow hills. And there they discover and create the land of Tir na Nog, which also is synonymous with the land of the fairies, because it is there. These mounds were also called the She Mounds. This is pronounced She, or the Eoshi, however you want to say it, and if you do the old Irish thing. But it's the beginning of the Fae. They become the fairies. And so the Tuatha de Dannan go beneath the hollow hills into the land of Tir na Nog and become the fairies. And so then, at that point, the Tuatha de Dannan are no longer in this world, but they're in the other world, a place near here. And it is there that it becomes absent from day-to-day history, like we expect to see them in physical incarnation in the world, and more of a mystical presence. And that's the beginning of what we call today fairies. Irish fairies, and all the other subsequent stories that come from there are built on that. Things like leprechauns and all this other stuff. They all come from this story. This is the oldest version of the story where the She came from. And so the She, or the Fae, or the fairies, they then become a sort of folk tale in Irish lore, but one that people throughout the countryside that they really adhere to. You know, you have situations where families would set cups of milk and stuff on their windowsills, knowing that in the nighttime, when the veil was thin between here and there, the other world and here, that the Fae would come back out of the hollow hills and come into this world and be here as the fairies. And they were never good or never bad. They were just as wild as nature was itself. You never really knew. They didn't have an opinion. So if you helped them, they might help you. So you started having situations where people would live on land for a long, long time, and they would set out on their fence posts, you know, around their fields, little gifts, knowing that if they left those gifts there, that the Fae would come and keep the deer or the rabbits or whatever away from their crops at night. Because they knew that when they died, they were going into the ground to degrade into the ground, and they were born of the same ground, and they ate the fish, and they drank the water, and they were with the trees, and they were all part of the same world. You know, the way the Celts look at it, all land is Celtic land. They've always been there, and they always will. They didn't sort of have any of these true creation type things, but in this way, they were all part of it. And they figured that with the Fae in the other world, that they could have a symbiotic relationship with them to help one another. And that's where the whole thing really began in the Irish tradition of why up until this day in certain areas of Ireland, much like in, which we'll talk about next week with the Norse, like you have in Iceland with the dwarves and things like that, and the elves, here you have the fairies that they saw as something that could be good or it could be bad. It all depended on how you interacted with it. But it was just like the natural world itself. You know, the wolf is not inherently good or bad. The wolf is a wolf. You know, nature isn't, the storm is not there to get you. The storm is the storm. You know, and they had this sort of very look at the world that it just is. You know, like something that I say a lot, life is, and anything you say after that is your opinion of it. And I think that they really embodied it, at least in the way that it comes down in this telling of this tradition. Now, how it went on a day-to-day level, and 8 BC or whatever it might have been, who knows? But that's the way that it comes down, and that's the sort of idealistic way of looking at it, you could say, and certainly a neo way of looking at it, because that's my interpretation of it. But at the same time, it's a good way because it can remind us today how much we overstate things and concern ourselves with the good and badness of certain things, which are just really our opinions of it. And I think that this whole story with the Tuatha de Dannan features so many levels of that. And like I said, these past few pages are just touching on the surface of what the depth of what I've gotten out of it. But I just wanted to tell you this in sort of a teaching tale about who they are, because you don't hear a lot about the Tuatha de Dannan. You hear lots about Celtic mythology. You know, you hear about Cernunnos and all these other things, but those are either other areas of the Celtic world, and there's certainly a lot of sort of, you could translate this into that as a similar vibe, similar feel But at the same time, this is the stark purity of what we know of the Tuatha de Dannan story, which is the only one that we have in sort of written format like this, as old as it is, and it's the oldest that we have. So that's where I'm at on the telling of the Tuatha de Dannan, their arrival from a place near here, and their departure to the other world, which is a place near here. And so when you're looking at it with a shamanic point of view, you know, you hear about all the various traditions talking about astral projection and the spirit realm and these other types of things. When you're looking at it from a Celtic perspective, you would be thinking of it as the other world. You would be maybe connecting with those spirits. That doesn't mean you have to be exclusive to that. And certainly there's nobody that knows for sure how to do that. These are old oral traditions that were written down and reinterpreted. So nobody today is either any more right or wrong about it. It's up to each one of us. It's a personal experience. You know, now there are some other traditions that do have existing uninterrupted things, and that's different. That's not the case with any of the pagan, the Norse and the Celts. So it's up to our own interpretation. So therefore it's not, you know, we're not pretending to be anything or acting like anything. What we're basically trying to do here is, regardless of your own biological ancestry, it's a way of looking back at how another indigenous people had their worldview and where they saw themselves in it. And if you can take anything from that story and build upon it, then do that. It's certainly your right as an individual, as a sovereign person. So if there's any questions on this first almost hour, I guess ask them now. Huli is going to be, this is how high speed I am. She's going to be sending me messages if there are. If not, what I would like to do is to take a minute and I'm going to regroup here, have a glass of water, and then turn my camera off for just a second, let you all just relax. But what I would like to ask you to do while you enter in any kind of questions or anything like that, also get yourself in a quiet space. Try to turn off the outside world, put in your headset. I'm going to rattle a little bit, and I'm going to do a sort of hybrid shamanic journey. It's going to be more of a shamanic meditation, this will be the first time I've ever tried this. But I want to do this, and I want to sort of take you through the Celtic world, some of it from here, some of it from a greater understanding of Celtic stuff in general, and go from there if you're interested. So, and at the end of this, we'll have more questions, and then I want to tell you about some other things that I have coming up in this regard. But, so it's 7:52 now. How about in about 5 minutes, let's come back and start answering questions, and then at 8 o'clock, we'll get into this journey.